In London, a black cab was never just a way to get from one street to another. It was a shape people recognized before they recognized the driver. A tall roofline in the rain, a glowing taxi sign under the yellow streetlights, a door opening beside a curb, a turning circle tight enough to swing through old streets that were never designed for modern traffic. For decades, that shape seemed permanent. Tourists photographed it. Londoners depended on it. Drivers spent years learning the city before earning the right to sit behind its wheel. And far away from the traffic of the capital, in Coventry, generations of workers built the machine that carried London's image around the world. But by the early 21st century, the factory behind the black cab was no longer secure. Its market was narrow. Its finances were strained. Its old manufacturing model was under pressure from global competition, emissions rules, new technology, and a transport revolution coming through the smartphone. Then came a recall, a steering fault, suspended sales, administration, redundancies. A company that had built one of Britain's most famous vehicles was suddenly fighting for survival. The black cab did not disappear. But the world that made it did. And the deeper question is not simply how the London taxi nearly collapsed. It is how a vehicle so deeply tied to British identity became dependent on foreign rescue, electric reinvention, and a future that no longer belonged only to the streets of London. There are many vehicles that move through London, but very few become part of the city's language. A bus can be replaced by a newer bus. A train carriage can be modernized and still remain anonymous. But the black cab became something different. It was transportation, architecture, memory, and civic ritual compressed into one vehicle. It stood outside railway stations. It waited in lines near hotels and theaters. It carried office workers through the financial district, families from airports, tourists across bridges, patients to hospitals, and strangers home after midnight. Its importance came not only from what it looked like, but from the system around it. The London taxi was regulated, purpose-built, designed for a city with narrow streets, dense traffic, old junctions, and a passenger culture that expected direct professional service. It needed room for luggage. It needed space for passengers who might be wearing overcoats or carrying shopping. It needed accessibility. It needed durability. It needed to survive years of hard stop-start urban work. And it had to be driven by people who had mastered the knowledge, the famously demanding study of London's streets, routes, landmarks, and connections that made the cab more than a product. It made it the physical expression of a profession. The driver brought the knowledge. The vehicle brought the form. The city provided the stage. From the passenger seat, the black cab felt like a small room on wheels. You sat upright. You faced forward or sideways. You could see the city through tall windows. The vehicle had a democratic quality, official enough for business, familiar enough for daily life, practical enough for anyone who needed a reliable ride. But what looked inevitable on the street was never inevitable in the factory. Behind the famous shape was a fragile industrial chain: designers, dealers, regulators, engineers, coach builders, suppliers, welders, assemblers, inspectors, drivers, and buyers. The cab survived because all of these groups kept agreeing, year after year, that this unusual machine still made sense. For a long time, it did. Then the conditions that protected it began to change. The story begins not with a styling idea, but with a set of requirements. London's taxi trade needed vehicles that could do a very specific job. The city was old, crowded, and tightly regulated. A normal car was not enough. A taxi had to be easy to enter, tough enough for commercial use, and maneuverable enough for London's streets. That is why the black cab should be understood as a machine shaped by rules as much as by imagination. The early taxi dealers, Mann and Overton, played a central role in this story. They understood the cab trade not as a normal car market, but as a professional ecosystem. Drivers needed vehicles that could earn money every day. Fleet owners needed reliability. Passengers needed comfort and trust. Regulators needed standards. In the early 20th century, purpose-built taxi design became a way of solving that problem. By the post-war years, the system had settled into a powerful relationship. Austin provided engineering. Mann and Overton understood the market. Carbody's, the Coventry coach builder, built the bodies and assembled the vehicles. This was not mass-market car production in the ordinary sense. It was specialized manufacturing. A black cab was not built for millions of consumers, choosing between colors and trim levels. It was built for one difficult trade, in one demanding city. Under rules that made ordinary cars unsuitable, that specialization gave the vehicle its strength. It allowed the black cab to become highly adapted to London's needs. Its proportions were practical rather than fashionable. Its high roof was not an accident of style. It was part of the passenger experience. Its turning ability was not a gimmick. It was a requirement of the city. Its durability mattered because the vehicle was a workplace. But specialization also created a danger. The more perfectly a company serves one market, the more exposed it becomes when that market changes. For decades, that weakness was hidden by success. London needed the cab. Drivers bought the cab. The public recognized the cab. The vehicle became so familiar that it seemed almost outside the normal laws of business. But no factory is outside those laws. A factory must invest. It must modernize. It must meet new regulations. It must control costs. It must sell enough vehicles to justify the machinery, labor, engineering, tooling, testing, and supply chain behind them. The London taxi had cultural power. But cultural power does not automatically pay for new platforms, new engines, new safety systems, or new emissions technology. That tension would define the company's future. The irony of the London taxi is that much of its industrial identity belonged not to London, but to Coventry. Coventry had long been one of Britain's great motor manufacturing cities. Its industrial landscape was built around metalwork, engineering, components, body construction, and vehicle assembly. The black cab emerged from that world. For workers in Coventry, the cab was not only an icon seen on postcards. It was metal, panels, parts, tolerances, paint, tools, shifts, wages, and accumulated skill. The vehicle's identity was national, but the work was local. That matters because every famous industrial product has two lives. One life belongs to the public, the brand, the image, the emotional meaning. The other belongs to the people who make it, the routine, the pressure, the pride, the anxiety when orders slow down. A cab rolling past Westminster could feel timeless, but in the factory, time was always present. Orders had to be met. Components had to arrive. Old designs had to be updated. Workers had to adapt. Management had to find capital. A product that looked unchanged to the public still required constant effort behind the scenes. When the FX models entered the trade, they were not just vehicles. They were part of a post-war reconstruction of mobility. Britain was rebuilding. London was changing. The taxi had to be modern enough for a new era, but conservative enough for a profession that valued reliability over novelty. Then came the FX4. Introduced in the late 1950s, the FX4 became the black cab most people carried in their imagination. Its rounded, upright silhouette became so deeply associated with London that later taxis could change engines, interiors, materials, and drivetrains, while still having to respect the same visual memory. This is one reason the black cab story is so unusual. Most vehicles become obsolete when their design gets old. The black cab became more powerful because its design aged. It accumulated meaning. It became a moving landmark, but that created another trap. When a shape becomes iconic, change becomes risky. If you alter it too much, people say you have destroyed the character. If you alter it too little, the product may fall behind the world around it. For the London taxi maker, every new model had to answer an impossible question. How do you modernize a symbol without making it stop being itself? The FX4's long life was both a triumph and a warning. It proved that the London taxi had found an almost perfect form for its role. The vehicle could be revised, upgraded, re-engined, adapted, and improved while still remaining recognizable. Drivers trusted it. Passengers knew it. The city absorbed it into its identity. But long production lives can conceal underinvestment. A vehicle can remain beloved while the industrial base beneath it grows weaker. The public sees continuity. Engineers see compromise. Drivers see familiarity. Accountants see narrowing margins. By the 1980s and 1990s, the British motor industry around the black cab had already changed dramatically. The world of domestic mass manufacturing had been reduced by closures, mergers, foreign competition, and shifting ownership structures. Britain still had car factories, but the old ecosystem that had supported companies of every size was no longer what it had been. The London taxi survived because it occupied a protected niche. It was not trying to beat every family car, every van or every global taxi platform. It served a regulated market, where its design gave it an advantage. But protection can soften the pressure to reinvent until reinvention becomes unavoidable. The Fairway, the TX1, the TXI, and the TX4 all represented attempts to keep the old idea alive while meeting new expectations. Engines changed, interiors improved, accessibility became more central, emission standards tightened, passenger comfort mattered more. Drivers expected a workplace that felt less like an antique machine and more like a modern commercial vehicle. The company was not standing still, but it was carrying a difficult inheritance. The black cab had to be old and new at the same time, old enough to reassure London, new enough to satisfy regulators, traditional enough to keep drivers loyal, modern enough to survive the market. That balance became harder every year. A niche business can look secure from the outside. The London taxi maker had a famous product. It had heritage. It had a regulated market. It had visibility beyond anything most small vehicle manufacturers could dream of. But fame and financial strength are not the same thing. The market for purpose-built London taxis was limited. Unlike a global car maker, the company could not spread engineering costs across millions of vehicles. A new model required serious investment, but the number of buyers was relatively small. Every regulatory change could demand expensive redesign. Every supplier problem could hit production hard. Every decline in driver confidence could reduce orders. And then the wider transport world began to shift. Private hire vehicles grew. App-based mobility changed passenger habits. Consumers became used to tapping a screen, seeing a price, and watching a car approach in real time. The black cab still had strengths: professional drivers, accessibility, street hail rights, deep city knowledge, but its monopoly over convenience was being challenged. At the same time, environmental policy was moving against diesel. For a vehicle built around urban work, emissions could no longer be treated as a secondary issue. Cities wanted cleaner air. Regulators wanted lower carbon output. Passengers became more aware of pollution. The future was moving toward electrification. For the London taxi maker, this was not a simple upgrade. It was a structural challenge. To build an electric or zero-emission capable taxi required new technology, new capital, and new engineering depth. It meant entering a different industrial age. The old factory knowledge still mattered, but it was no longer enough by itself. The company needed money at precisely the moment when its old business model was becoming more fragile. This is the hidden weakness behind many industrial decline stories. The fatal blow rarely comes from one event alone. It comes when a company already under pressure meets a crisis it cannot absorb. For Manganese Bronze and the London Taxi Company, that crisis arrived in 2012. In October 2012, the black cab maker was hit by a steering-related recall on the TX4. On the surface, it was a technical problem. Vehicles had to be recalled. Sales were suspended. Fixes had to be made. But in a company with limited financial room, a technical problem can become an existential problem. The recall struck at the worst possible place: trust. A taxi is not a weekend vehicle. It is a working machine. A driver depends on it for income. Passengers depend on it for safety. Regulators depend on it meeting standards. If confidence breaks, the damage spreads quickly. Production depends on cash flow. Cash flow depends on sales. Sales depend on confidence. Once sales are suspended, the entire system begins to tighten. By late 2012, Manganese Bronze entered administration. The human consequences were immediate. Jobs were lost. Workers who had built a world-famous vehicle faced uncertainty. The story of an icon became, for many families, a story about wages, redundancy, and whether a specialized skill still had a place in Britain. This is where the sentimental version of industrial history becomes inadequate. It is easy to say that Britain loved the black cab. It is harder to explain why love was not enough to save the company that built it. The collapse revealed the difference between symbolic value and industrial resilience. The black cab was priceless as an image of London. But the firm behind it still needed capital, stable production, modern technology, and a viable market. A famous brand can survive in memory long after a balance sheet fails. In 2012, the old business had reached that dangerous line. The cab still mattered. The factory still had skill. The drivers still needed vehicles. The city still wanted the symbol. But the company could not continue in its existing form. If the black cab was going to survive, someone else would have to pay for its future. The buyer came from China. Geely already had a stake in the business before the collapse. In 2013, it acquired the London Taxi Company's assets out of administration. More than a rescue, it was a signal that the next chapter of the black cab would not be written inside the old British industrial framework alone. To some observers, this felt uncomfortable. The black cab was one of the most British-looking vehicles in existence. Its rescue by a Chinese automotive group seemed to capture a larger national anxiety, that Britain could still produce powerful symbols, but no longer always possessed the capital structure to sustain them. But there is another way to see it. Geely did not simply buy a failed factory. It bought heritage, regulatory knowledge, design identity, and a product with global recognition. Hayes saw potential where the old company had run out of room. The rescue preserved production in Coventry. It kept the black cab alive. It gave the company access to investment that would have been difficult to generate from the old niche taxi market alone. But rescue also meant transformation. The black cab could not survive merely as a nostalgic diesel vehicle. It had to become part of the new energy transition. The very pressures that had threatened the company, emissions rules, urban pollution, technological change, now became the basis of its rebirth. This is one of the great reversals in the story. The old company nearly died because it could not carry the cost of modernization. The new company would justify its existence by becoming modernization itself. The question was whether the icon could survive the surgery. Could a black cab be electric and still feel like a black cab? Could a Coventry-built taxi become part of a global electric vehicle strategy without losing the local meaning that made it valuable? Could a vehicle born from London's street rules become a product for cities far beyond London? Those questions shaped the new factory. In 2017, the company opened a new headquarters and manufacturing facility at Anstey near Coventry. The symbolism was deliberate. This was not only a continuation of the old taxi maker. It was a declaration that the black cab would be rebuilt for a different industrial century. The new TX was designed as a zero-emission capable taxi using electric drive with a range extender system. It kept the visual grammar of the traditional cab, the upright presence, the passenger space, the accessibility, the professional purpose. But underneath, the machine belonged to a different technological world. The old cab had been a diesel workhorse. The new cab had to answer questions about batteries, charging, emissions, software, and urban air quality. The factory itself became part of the story. Instead of an aging industrial site fighting to keep an old product alive, Anstey was presented as a modern electric vehicle facility, combining research, manufacturing, quality control, and lightweight aluminium capability. This was a rebirth, but not a return. The old London Taxi Company had been saved, renamed, and redirected. LEVC, the London EV company, signaled that the business was no longer only about taxis. The name pointed toward electric commercial vehicles, global markets, and a wider portfolio. For Coventry, the story was mixed but meaningful. The old industrial world had not come back in its original form. But work remained. Engineering remained. Assembly remained. The black cab still had a manufacturing home near the city that had shaped it for generations. For London, the TX offered continuity at street level. A passenger could still step into a black cab and recognize the experience. A wheelchair user could still rely on purpose-built accessibility. A driver could still operate a vehicle designed around the taxi trade rather than adapted from an ordinary car. But the economics had changed. Electric taxis were expensive. Government grants mattered. Charging infrastructure mattered. Driver confidence mattered. And the black cab now faced a competitor that did not need to build iconic vehicles at all. It only needed an app. The modern threat to the black cab is not another black cab. It is the private hire vehicle summoned by phone, tracked on a map, priced before the journey, and integrated into the habits of a generation that expects transport to behave like software. This did not make the black cab obsolete, but it changed the competitive field. For decades, the black cab's advantage was immediacy and trust. You could hail it. You knew it was licensed. You knew the driver had passed the knowledge. You knew the vehicle was built for the job. App-based private hire changed the meaning of convenience. It offered visibility, payment integration, estimated arrival times, and often lower prices. The passenger no longer needed to understand the difference between taxi and private hire to choose what felt easiest. At the same time, new drivers faced a difficult calculation. Becoming a black cab driver required time, training, and commitment. Buying or financing a purpose-built electric taxi required significant money. The profession still carried status, but the barriers were high. For many people entering the transport economy, private hire looked faster, cheaper, and more flexible. That created a new problem for the factory. A taxi manufacturer depends not only on passengers, but on drivers willing to buy the vehicle. If fewer drivers enter the trade, fewer taxis are needed. If the cost of the vehicle rises, replacement slows. If grants fall away, the transition becomes harder. So the black cab's future now depends on forces beyond the factory floor. It depends on licensing rules, public policy, charging networks, driver recruitment, street access, bus lane rules, taxi ranks, disability access priorities, and the broader question of what kind of urban transport London wants to protect. The cab has survived bankruptcy. It has survived technological reinvention. But survival in the app age is a different test. It is not enough for the vehicle to be loved. It must be used. It is not enough for it to be iconic. It must be economically possible. It is not enough for the factory to build the cab. The city must still make room for the trade. The London taxi factory story does not end with silence. That is what makes it different from many industrial decline stories. The name changed. The ownership changed. The technology changed. The factory site changed. But the product did not vanish entirely. The black cab survived by becoming something else. That survival is both hopeful and uneasy. Hopeful, because it shows that industrial heritage does not have to mean museum heritage. A historic product can be redesigned. A skilled region can adapt. A familiar object can carry new technology without losing every trace of its old meaning. Uneasy, because the rescue came after collapse. It required foreign capital. It required a new business model. It required the old company to pass through administration before the future could be built, and it raises a larger question about Britain's industrial memory. What does it mean to keep an icon if the system that created it has disappeared? The black cab still moves through London. It still appears in photographs, films, advertisements, and memories. It still offers one of the most accessible forms of door-to-door transport in the city. It still represents a professional tradition that cannot be reduced to an algorithm. But behind the familiar silhouette is a changed reality. The cab is now part of a global electric vehicle strategy. Its manufacturer is owned by a Chinese automotive group. Its market is shaped by emissions rules, urban transport policy, driver economics, app competition, and the accelerating transformation of mobility. The story is not simply that Britain lost a factory, it is that a factory survived only by becoming a bridge between two worlds. The old world of Coventry coach building, and the new world of electric urban transport. The old world of regulated street knowledge, and the new world of app-based convenience. The old world of national industrial pride, and the new world of global capital. For the workers, the drivers, and the city, the black cab remains more than a vehicle. It is a test of whether tradition can adapt without being hollowed out. It is a test of whether accessibility and professionalism can survive in a transport economy obsessed with speed and price. It is a test of whether iconic manufacturing can remain living manufacturing rather than nostalgia. The London taxi once mattered because it gave a city a machine perfectly shaped to its streets. It nearly collapsed because the industrial model behind that machine could no longer carry the cost of the future, and it still matters because Every time one of those cabs moves through London, it carries the evidence of a difficult truth. Sometimes an icon survives, but only after the world that made it has already gone.